And we're back.
All right, well, welcome back. We're on hour 3 of ID 24, and we have Jason Kiss from New Zealand, and it's practical accessibility assessment, getting past compliance. Jason, it's all yours.
Great, thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to quickly move into the slides, I guess, and see what we can get going. Great, so I'm assuming everyone can see that first slide.
Yep.
Great. So the title of the talk is Practical Accessibility Assessment, Getting Past Compliance Testing, and really I'm just going to take you through sort of a story of where the New Zealand government has been over the past 3-4 years in terms of establishing and promoting its accessibility requirements and dealing with assessment at the government agency level, and how we're continually trying to make this attempt to move past a real compliance-oriented approach and get to something more practical, something useful, something that's that web practitioners can turn into meaningful results in terms of delivering accessibility. But before we get right to that, let's share some fun facts about New Zealand. That's where I live, in New Zealand. If you aren't aware, New Zealand is really just 2 large islands with some smaller side islands in the South Pacific. Not a large population, about 4.5 million people. So the same size as some large cities. It's a really lovely place. If you haven't been, you should come. Right now, there's showing a poster from Flight of the Conchords, if you've seen that, showing a bunch of sheep along a highway, and at the bottom, the caption is, "New Zealand, you should come," but "you" is spelled E-W-E, which is a female sheep. And there are a lot of sheep in New Zealand, so sheep humor is quite common and certainly appropriate in the sense that there are about 6 sheep per person in New Zealand right now. We have 27.6 million sheep for a population of 4.5 million people. That makes about 6 roughly sheep per person. And that's actually not very much. In 1982, there were about 70 million sheep in New Zealand, or 22 sheep per person. So we've gone down quite a ways from that. New Zealand also gets a lot of earthquakes. We get about 15,000 earthquakes a year, and that's over 40 per day. Fortunately, normally you can't really feel most of them. But with that number of earthquakes, you do eventually get used to the occasional rumble. Recently in the news, as if you needed more reasons to visit New Zealand, we're now a continent called Zealandia. Sure, 94% of it might be underwater, but still, we're not just a couple of islands now. We're an actual continent on our own called Zealandia. So a bit about the New Zealand government. Of course, with a small population, the government reflects that, and itself is relatively small. In the country, we have very few accessibility experts and consultants, despite New Zealand's government size, like most governments, we just have had this proliferation of websites. So nobody really knows how many websites we have, like most governments. I suspect most governments don't really know how many websites they have, and we're no different. But we certainly have way more than 500. So if you're a citizen trying to navigate government online, that number of websites can just be really tricky to navigate. And so, of course, most governments are working on consolidating websites, consolidating web content, reducing the number of websites that the public needs to go to interact with government. So that's pretty common. In New Zealand, again, we're doing that same sort of thing. Since 2003, New Zealand government has had a cabinet mandate requiring that all core government agencies, of which there are about 32 right now, implement what back then were called the New Zealand Government Guidelines. And at that point in time in 2003, WCAG 1.0 was the the international standards. In 2008, of course, WCAG 2 came out, and shortly thereafter, in early 2010, New Zealand Government Web Standards 2.0 were launched. And New Zealand was actually the first government in the world to formally adopt WCAG 2 as its government standard. So it's been 7 years now that WCAG 2 has been a requirement for New Zealand government agencies. In 2011, we had government agencies self-assess their websites. It was a very, very simple self-assessment. And in the end, the results weren't very comprehensive or useful. The way they were collated made it difficult to actually turn those results into actionable or into action that would improve accessibility. But the one thing that came out of that was a very clear indication that not only government agencies, but also web vendors had variable knowledge and skill when it came to accessibility. And so that was a really, just a really clear outcome of that test. And that was important because it gave us something to tackle. In July 2013, partly based on that earlier self-assessment, but also based on some consultations we held with the disability communities, the vendor communities, and government agencies, we launched a revised web accessibility standard. We still required WCAG 2 AA as we had since 2010, but we added a few exceptions. I won't go into those now, but for all intents and purposes, we were looking at WCAG 2 as our requirement. And we reestablished an implementation schedule, another implementation schedule. We had been, since 2010, requiring WCAG 2, but agencies were having a difficult time implementing that. So we thought, let's start again, so to speak, and say, you now have 4 years, and according to this implementation schedule, you will eventually, by July 2017, make all of your government web content WCAG 2 AA accessible. A year after that, we decided we wanted to get a sense of where government agencies were with regard to implementing that new or renewed government web accessibility standard. And so in 2014, we asked agencies to self-assess again. Now, before I get into the details of that self-assessment and what came out of it, I want to talk a bit about something I call the compliance conflict. Now, most governments have policy and or some kind of legislation regarding web accessibility. Yay, this is a good thing. But defining what makes web content accessible is difficult, and it's technical. In most cases, web accessibility in these policies, these legislation, tends to be defined in terms of a technical standard, usually WCAG 2 AA or some variant thereof. And yes, we know that these standards aren't perfect in that none of them comprehensively describes that set of minimum conditions that are required for maximum universal web accessibility in a way that allows for unambiguous testing, right? So we're all in that same situation. The standard that we point to, the technical standard, it's not comprehensive and it's not perfect. But when we define web accessibility and measure web accessibility in terms of a technical standard like that, there's always the danger that our goal of delivering accessible web content is going to be reduced to attaining some kind of score in a compliance assessment, right? That danger just is there when we equate web accessibility with some technical standard. And when web accessibility knowledge and skill among web teams is already so variable, if not somewhat sparse, and when web teams are already under so many other competing demands, it may be understandable for web teams to focus on compliance and testing in this way, so that they can just, what do I need to test? What requirements do I need to meet and check off, so to speak, so that I can just get this accessibility thing done. However, when we do that, that's really one of the least effective ways to help someone develop that broader knowledge and skill that they can sustainably apply in any new design or development opportunities to ensure accessibility is met. And a small aside here, of course, if a standard and the tests for that standard were universally comprehensive and reliable in terms of accessibility, then a focus on technical compliance would be fine, right? Because you comply to that technical standard. If that technical standard were comprehensive and perfect, then we'd have full coverage. But on the assumption that the standards and tests that we have are insufficient, in that they're not comprehensive, then even getting a top compliance score will never mean that you're accessible. Even if the standards and tests we had were comprehensively perfect in that sense, that they guaranteed universal accessibility, the case is that the world and technology are not static. And so there's nothing sustainable about the scenario, because there's no focus on developing an understanding and knowledge that will enable the kind of flexibility needed to adapt to that change, to ensure that accessibility is continually addressed in future scenarios. So, the upshot is that equating web accessibility with compliance assessment ultimately makes it more difficult for us to ensure the accessibility of websites for our end users. And I'd suggest that this kind of internal conflict is core to most governments' approach to and their difficulty with delivering accessible web content. Or at least in New Zealand, we've recognized it that way. And so with that in mind, our 2014 self-assessment were intended to not be a compliance exercise. We made a point to declare it not a compliance exercise. Instead, the goals were ostensibly to report on agency progress after 1 year, to establish a baseline by which we can measure continual improvement, to raise awareness, knowledge, and skill among web practitioners within government agencies and among management as well, and then to take what we learned from this self-assessment to inform future training for agencies and vendors. So what did that mean in terms of a methodology? Well, initially we had looked at the W3C's WCAG evaluation methodology, which is a great evaluation methodology, don't get me wrong, but it's very detailed, it's very comprehensive, and we felt for our purposes it was too comprehensive. We have small web teams in government agencies, and those web teams often don't include people with web design skills or web development skills. Often a lot of that is outsourced. And it's also not feasible when we have so many websites for each government agency to test each one of those. It would just be too much effort and too much cost. So we took a different approach, somewhat informed by work that the Canadian government had done earlier, where we asked each agency not to assess each one of its websites, but to assess its web presence, if you will. So from across a government agency's web presence, from across all of its websites, each agency was to select up to 5 home pages, up to 5 contact us pages, and up to 68 randomly selected pages. And those were weighted in terms of visits, right? So those random pages were selected from the most visited pages from the most visited websites. And agencies were supposed to take those pages, up to 78 pages max, and assess them against all WCAG 2A and AA requirements. It was up to them whether they did it entirely in-house, if they had the resources, or they outsourced it entirely to a vendor, or they did some kind of combination. And because of the range of knowledge and skill among those who were going to be doing the testing, we expected incorrect and inaccurate assessments. We were ready for that. Agencies performed their assessment, and then they recorded their results in quite this complicated Excel spreadsheet. They recorded a pass and fail for each success criterion out of WCAG, and then they included a reason for each of those failures. We also asked them, after they had completed that assessment, to group, rate, and prioritize those failures. So in other words, to consider all of those failures in terms of risk from a risk management approach, asking questions like, where's the biggest bang for the buck in terms of addressing a particular failure? Should we address this failure now, or should we wait for our next redesign or redevelopment cycle? What happens if someone calls us on this risk, or the risk associated with a particular accessibility barrier manifests itself? What do we do then? Let's have a plan to respond to each risk associated with each group of accessibility failures. And as I noted, the range of people performing the assessments was varied. Web teams in government agencies involve communications people, project managers. Sometimes they'll include IT test people. Sometimes content authors, content designers, UX, and information architecture folk, developers, and anybody else who happens to be working on delivering that agency's web content. So quite a range of individuals with different levels of knowledge and skill in terms of web technologies and certainly accessibility. And so they needed help. We prepared a couple of easy to understand guides for testing, but for example, with the web accessibility standard, that guide ended up being about 60 pages long. And the tests, they get quite complicated, especially when we're dealing with those more complex technical requirements like success criterion 131 and 412. 131 being about ensuring that structure and relationships between bits of content can be interpreted by assistive technologies, and 412 being about making sure that interactive components on the page have accessible names, that it's clear programmatically what they do and what their current state are. So those are some of the difficulties. On the plus side, running through these easy to understand guides helped those practitioners learn more about accessibility and how to test for accessibility. We also held a bunch of self-assessment workshops whereby web practitioners or the people doing the tests could just basically show up and say, this is one of the pages that we need to test. Can we look at it? And ask questions about particular aspects of that page that they need to test. We would just all share how we would approach testing that particular aspect or component on their page. So agencies performed that self-assessment. They submitted the results, and then it was up to us to analyze and audit them. So a working group that we had made up of representatives from disability communities, from government agencies, as well as from the vendor community, contributed some of their time, and we assessed each agency's submissions. We assessed 5 pages from each of their submissions. So for each agency, government agency, we audited their results, and basically we assessed one of their home pages, one of their contact us pages, and then 3 of the random pages that they tested, in order to get a sense of the difference between, or the variance between what they scored and what we scored in terms of passes and failures against WCAG. And so what came out of that? What were the results? Well, the interesting thing is, and I've already started speaking in this way, the minute you have a whole bunch of requirements against which you're measuring passes and failures, ultimately you end up talking about compliance rates. So, it was not meant to be a compliance exercise, but somehow we still end up finding ourselves talking about passes and failures, or compliance ultimately. Briefly, looking at the specific results or pass failures or compliance rates, we're looking here at the top 7 success criteria with the lowest compliance rates. So just talking about the top 5, for example, again, WCAG 131, info and relationships, that had an average compliance rate of 25%. WCAG 1.1.1, non-text content, that had a compliance rate of 34%. 143, which is about color contrast, that had a compliance rate of 36%, as did success criterion 4.1.2, which is again one of those more complicated ones, 36% compliance rate. And then 2.4.7, which is ensuring that sighted users who don't use a mouse can tell which page element currently has focus. Right, and that had a compliance rate, an average compliance rate of 38%. So well under 40% compliance rate for these 5 success criteria. And the interesting thing, or one interesting thing about that, we felt was that those top 5 failures are arguably 5 of the most important WCAG 2 success criteria. You know, we're talking about alternative text for images, making sure that information and relationships visually presented on the screen are available to those using assistive technologies, that color contrast is appropriate to ensure that everyone can read text on the page easily, can see it, that page components on the page, when they receive focus, there's a clear visible indicator of that, so that sighted users who don't use a mouse and instead rely on a keyboard can get through it easily. And finally, that interactive components, each interactive component has a name that it's called. It's clear what it is and what it does, and what current values or states it has. So those are, you know, in some ways, those are 5 of the most important WCAG 2 success criteria, and these are the 5 success criteria that agencies are having the most difficulty with. So that gave us something to target. So what are our conclusions about this after we did this test? Well, first and foremost, it was an awful lot of work. Agencies spent hours and hours, and in some cases, quite a bit of money performing these self-assessments. It was very comprehensive in terms of an accessibility assessment, in terms of the number of tests that they had to do. It was very technically difficult for a lot of agency assessors, again, because they just didn't have that familiarity with web technologies, or especially with those more complicated WCAG 2 success criteria. And as I just mentioned, it came at a high cost to some agencies, whether that was just in employee time or in taxpayers' money that was spent in order to complete those self-assessments. The results that came back from agencies ranged in their accuracy, right? We had to audit those results because they weren't quite accurate. And even our audit was going to have some degree of inaccuracy because our working group was not made up of accessibility experts entirely. And even then, we all know that you know, accessibility is somewhat of a gray area, and it's rare for accessibility consultants, subject matter experts, to agree on a whole number of success criteria, or given a certain web page, whether it meets it or doesn't. You know, we're looking at variable accuracy in those results, and the results in that sense are somewhat suspect. They're never going to be 100% reliable in that way. And remember, the whole time, there we are saying, this was not a compliance exercise. Still, it had that sense. It felt like a compliance exercise. Why? Well, we had this statistical approach to how pages were going to be selected. We were going to be sampling pages in order to ensure some degree of statistical representation. We were testing all WCAG 2 A and AA requirements. We were asking agencies to assess those failures in terms of risk, some kind of risk management framework. The results ended up being reported to the government chief information officer. Those results were audited by a central working group. And ultimately, all those pass-fail results ended up being converted into some kind of average compliance score. So in that sense, it ended up feeling much like a compliance exercise. But I would argue that in some ways, it really only felt that way. The results, you know, how an agency did against WCAG, didn't have any formal consequences. you weren't punished if you got below a certain score, but nor were you rewarded if you got higher than a certain score. And those scores weren't shared or compared. We weren't setting agencies up to compete against each other in terms of what numerical score they got against some arbitrary test, right? So in that sense, it wasn't really a compliance exercise, but it was certainly a reporting exercise. As I mentioned, the government chief information officer received a summary of those results. That report was published online, and the results were used to better understand our current state of accessibility in New Zealand government agencies. Those results were also used to help us identify what needed improvement, where we should be putting our energies in terms of future training and education for government agencies. So, agencies were definitely reporting back to us, but to the degree that it felt like a compliance exercise, that was really just a sense that you might get, but a very real sense. And ultimately, it was a worthwhile effort. The reports back from the people who performed the test was that they really appreciated it as an opportunity to improve their accessibility knowledge and their skill. It gave us an opportunity to talk about accessibility in detail, in technical detail. And it confirmed for us what we pretty much suspected already were the top accessibility issues. But it gave us some evidence to confirm that. And another anecdote that we got regularly from a bunch of agencies, and this was very useful for us, was that the whole self-assessment process was extremely useful for raising management awareness and management support for accessibility activities within government agencies. We heard from many people that we need to do this kind of reporting exercise again in order to keep that awareness and visibility around accessibility high among management. If you did want to read the full report, that's available at ict.govt.nz. And if you just search that site for self-assessments, you can read that report there. But since then, we've taken what we've learned and we've been making our best efforts to focus on activities that will continue to increase agency knowledge and skill, but more importantly, deliver practical, actionable results that web practitioners can turn in to basically the delivery of accessible content to the public. So some ways we've been doing that, we've been holding a good number of workshops with vendors. Vendors in New Zealand, as I suspect elsewhere, end up doing a lot of the design and development work that goes on with government websites. So it doesn't happen within government agencies, it gets outsourced. So we were really targeting vendors with our workshops. Workshops, just general introductions to accessibility, sort of accessibility for content authors, accessibility in ARIA for developers, which is a more technical workshop. And we'll just ask vendors to sponsor a location and provide morning tea. And then we would give them, all vendors who wanted to attend a half-day sort of workshop. So that's been going very well. We've also published some quick reference guides for content editors, designers, and developers. And excitedly, we are working on a new test methodology. And here the goals are to increase familiarity, knowledge, and skill, to help agencies check those deliverables that they get back from vendors. I mean, the same reason that government agencies outsource their work to vendors is why when we get the deliverable back from the vendor, we're unable to check whether or not it meets our accessibility requirements. We just don't have those skills in-house. We also wanted to help agencies bake in accessibility into what they're doing in their day-to-day web-oriented activities. And finally, help practitioners inform their managers about the importance of the web standards. We want to make it easier and reusable. So the new methodology is going to have two aspects to it. It's going to combine a free automated testing tool. And at this point, we're strongly leaning towards ACTS, DQ's ACTS in the Chrome extension, and combining that with a small collection of manual tests. and tests that focus on those top accessibility issues that we identified in the previous self-assessment. The idea is that this will be a reusable methodology and something that's quick and easy to use that government agencies or vendors or whoever can use anytime, anywhere, whether they just completed some kind of widget, whether they want to check a web page, or whether they want to check a collection of web pages. This should be less costly to agencies. It should reduce the amount of time that they spend assessing and the amount of money that they spend assessing. And ultimately, this methodology, not only can it get used anytime, anywhere, get integrated with web teams' daily work, but it can get reused for our annual self-assessments. So there, the goal is to have fewer tests, fewer very clear, easy to understand tests. Where possible, we first want to defer to automated tools, right? So where an automated testing tool is able to cover certain tests for us, we'll let that automated tool test those success criteria. And then we'll have a collection of easy to use tests, manual tests, organized by the topic of the test as opposed to the WCAG 2 success criteria. So again, trying to get away from compliance, instead focus on the test itself, the impact of the tests, the impact of the accessibility issue that that test addresses. And we're accepting that with these tests, we're not going to get comprehensive, absolute, pass-fail grades for each success criterion. We accept that these tests are going to provide an indicator of accessibility as opposed to an absolute pass-fail for compliance with this or that success criterion. We want those tests that we provide to be really clear, step-by-step procedures. And this is nothing new. I mean, W3C's Web Accessibility Initiative has had what it's called easy checks for a long time now. And these are great. These are just really simple, easy to understand tests that almost anybody can do to check a few accessibility issues, common accessibility issues that often become accessibility barriers. And so that's been there for quite a long time. But more recently, other organizations have been pursuing this same approach. So if 18F, a group from within Government Services, General Services Administration in the US government, 18F has this accessibility guide. And if you look at the tests that they put together there, they're very similar to what we are producing. Again, just simple tests oriented on specific topics, things like headings, tables, form labels, image, text alternatives. And then the test steps themselves are very discrete, very clear, simple tests. These tests don't establish absolute pass-fail scores against any success criterion, but they do provide a way to test accessibility in a way that gets you some practical results and a good indication of whether or not you're on the right track. eBay also has its oatmeal, which it's in progress, but again, it's another example of a small collection of easy step-by-step test procedures for getting an indicator of accessibility. So we're following in those footsteps. We do, with this new methodology, make some basic assumptions. We do need to assume some basic level of knowledge and skill among those who will be performing these tests. But it is quite basic. We expect that those who are doing these tests will be able to look at HTML markup, and identify what's an element, what's an attribute, and what that attribute's value is. Even if they don't exactly know what that element does, or what it means, or what a particular attribute value means, we want them to be able to look at HTML markup and say, yep, that is an OL element, an ordered list, and there it has LI elements nested, and maybe the OL element has a start attribute, for example. So we just need them to have that basic understanding, not be freaked out when they look at some HTML markup. but just be able to understand sort of the tree structure and what elements are. We also are going to settle on Chrome as the browser to test in, and we need those testers to be able to be comfortable with opening up the developer tools and inspecting elements. Again, just to inspect the DOM, and that's pretty much it in terms of using the dev tools. And finally, we want them, of course, to be able to run the Axe Chrome extension and be comfortable with running that. But that's pretty straightforward. Right now, we're going to focus on the top 5 accessibility issues. So we're going to have tests that, and I know I mentioned that our tests are not going to focus on success criteria, and they're not in terms of how they're presented to the testers. But for our internal purposes, we do want to make sure that our tests cover that range of issues that we identified as being the top issues among government websites in New Zealand. So again, 1.1.1 non-text content, 1.3.1 info and relationships, 1.4.3 minimum contrast, 2.4.7 visible focus indicators, and 4.1.2 name, role, and value. But while we're at it, we're going to include a few others. Governments are increasingly making good, heavy use of video for delivering government information. And so while we're in there, we're going to test for captions and for media alternatives to text. And also while we're in there testing for visible keyboard focus, we might as well test for full keyboard access. So test for keyboard operability and that there are no keyboard traps. And while we're starting with these, we do plan to develop a much larger collection of simpler tests, of easy step-by-step procedures for doing this kind of testing. And every year, our annual self-assessment will use a different subset of that collection. So we'll keep the annual self-assessments restricted to a certain number of tests, maybe 5, 6, or 7, out of a larger collection of simple tests that we will continue to develop. All the while, formally, WCAG 2 remains the standard that government agencies need to meet, right? And it's a standard in 2 ways. It's that formal standard. It's a technical standard with a set of requirements that you either pass or fail. But in another sense, to the degree that accessibility is almost a never-ending project, WCAG 2 or accessibility is a sort of an ideal standard. We can continually improve. Even if you meet all of WCAG, there are always ways you can improve the way in which you meet WCAG. And so I always think of WCAG 2 as a standard in those 2 senses. So let's look in a bit more detail at what we're doing. So the first step that we'll have in the methodology will involve running the Axe Chrome extension. We basically settled on Axe for a few reasons. One, it's free and open source. 2, again, considering the technical knowledge that testers will have, it needs to be easy. Whatever automated tool we run needs to be easy. And this Axe Chrome extension runs right in a browser. It's got a button. A new version is coming out shortly, so I'm really excited to see what new features it'll include. But for now, you just press the Analyze button, and then you get the results back. And agencies will just be basically copying and pasting the summary of those results into some kind of report when it comes to the annual self-assessment. When it comes to using this methodology in their day-to-day activities, well, then they can actually use those results from the Axe extension and address those immediately in their design and development work. But the nice thing about this is that using Axe, it basically covers a number of issues that we then don't have to provide manual tests for. So color contrast, labels, and discernible link text, those address a couple of success criteria that are in our top 5. But by testing these aspects of those success criteria using Axe, it means we don't have to worry about having explicit manual tests. So that's handy. Just by running a quick test, you can address some of those aspects. And again, sure, Axe might not be absolutely perfect. There may be some bugs in there as well in terms of its coverage of, contrast requirements of 1.4.3 or the technical requirements that come in success criterion 4.1.2 around accessible names, programmatically exposing name, role, state, and value. Axe is not going to cover all of that, but it does a really good job in identifying some of the major components that contribute to barriers with regards to those success criteria. So we're happy with that. We're getting a good indicator, not an absolute compliance score, which we're not concerned with. And then right now, we've got these 6 tests on our plate. We have a test around headings. We have a test around lists and tables. So it's just checking that they're marked up properly, that if the content is visually presented as a heading or a list, then it's marked up properly as such. Tables, if they're data tables, that column headers or row headers are properly marked up, that data tables are using proper structural data table markup. We got some simple tests around checking for keyboard accessibility, that everything that works with a mouse works with a keyboard, that there are no keyboard traps, and that every focusable component gets a visible focus indicator. We've got a test around images. Check each image on the page to make sure that it has a reasonable text alternative. And again, if there are videos, check that the video is properly captioned and that it has, and this is one of the exceptions we have with our web accessibility standard, you don't require to have an audio description, but you are required in each case to have what we call a full text transcript, which is, of course, a text version of all the meaningful audio and visual information in that synchronized media or video. So that's what we're testing right now. And just as a quick example before I close up here, this is the sort of step-by-step test that we're looking at, the sort of procedure that we're looking at. And this test is the test around headings. So really simply, the first step, we get the tester to open up Chrome, the page they're testing, they open it up in Chrome, and they use the web developer toolbar that you can get in order to basically outline or identify each heading on the page. And what that does is it looks for heading markup, and it puts a visible outline around each heading and indicates which heading tag is used, which heading element is used for that heading, whether it's an H1 or an H3 or an H6, right? Then the next step is to check that each heading identified on the page like that has the appropriate level for its position in the content hierarchy. So if it's an H3, is that a subheading to an H2 or an H1, for example? If that heading level is not appropriate, record a failure. Next, check that each heading identified on the page is visually presented as a heading and structurally serves as a heading. In other words, check that something that doesn't work as a heading isn't marked up as a heading, because that would also be a failure. And then the last step, if there's content on the page that is visually presented as a heading, for example, it's bigger and bolder, and that actually serves as a heading, in other words, it serves to identify or introduce or label the content that comes after it. If that content is not identified as a heading by the web developer toolbar, well, that means it's not marked up using a heading element. But it could be marked up using ARIA role heading with an appropriate ARIA level attribute, in which case check for that. And if that's okay, then great. But if it's not using an appropriate ARIA level attribute on some element with role equals heading, in that case, you need to record a failure. And that's it. That's sort of a simple step-by-step approach that almost anybody who can use Chrome, the web developer toolbar, and look at HTML markup should be able to do. And then that gives us a really strong indicator that not only headings are done, but some consideration has been made to ensure that markup, that the visual presentation and structure of markup has been represented in the HTML and programmatically. So that's an example of the sort of test we're doing. it's still a work in progress. It's going to go on for quite some time as we refine these tests. We test the procedures with people, with real users, and refine those, make them easier to use, and we expand that collection. But much like accessibility generally, it's a work in progress. So we're really excited about this work, but it's ongoing, and we'll eventually be publishing all of this once it gets closer to a final state. But that's all I had for you at the moment on that topic. Thanks very much. Any questions?
Well, Billy, are we back on, Billy?
We're back on.
Excellent. So thank you very much, Jason. So I had a question. This is Matt. So you mentioned that most of the websites are being done by third parties or web companies. How are you ensuring that they're actually bringing some skill to the table? Because it's when you think about a large contractor pool dumping in to do these websites, how do you ensure that's happening?
Great question. Well, there are internal policies that require that all outsourced web work meet the web accessibility standard. So that's supposed to be written into every contract for work that goes out. And that's that sort of that formalized requirement. That's the one way that we try and get vendors to deliver on that requirement or that goal that we have to make sure that all the online information and services we deliver as a government to the public are accessible. But that's just, that's a contractual requirement. In the end, it's not unusual, or in the past it hasn't been unusual for vendors to sort of approach that as a checkbox, basically, right? Yes, we meet the web standards. And government agencies aren't able, as I noted, to even check whether or not they have, whether the deliverable meets those requirements. So that contractual requirement only gets us so far. The more practical approach we're taking now are those workshops that we're doing. And they've been really great. We're seeing fantastic uptake or interest on the part of vendors, because I think vendors recognize internally, certainly those vendors that I've been speaking with closely, they recognize internally that they have room to develop their accessibility expertise. And so they're open to taking advantage of any help that we can provide in upskilling them in that regard. And we have a vested interest in that. And finally, I think if government agencies are able to use a test methodology like the one we're putting together to check those deliverables when they come back from a web vendor, that just gives government agencies a chance to double check that and then go back to the vendor and ask questions about any particular aspect of that deliverable that they're not sure of in terms of the accessibility, and just continually engage with the vendor and have an ongoing dialogue around improving the accessibility. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did. Very good. Thank you, Jason. And I want to thank you for participating in ID 20. I almost said it wrong. ID 24. I feel like I'm watching a TV show. And I think we are, right? 24 hours, right? So coming up next, are we up to hour 4 already? It's amazing.
Yes.
Hour 4, Bryce Johnson is going to be on deck. So what do we have, about 10 minutes of coffee break and then back on?
Great.
Excellent.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Catch you next time.
All righty. See you.
Great.